All right, strap in because this is going to be a wild one. Today, we are diving deep into Government Gangsters. It's a memoir by Kash Patel. Now, you probably remember him as a top aide to President Trump, but his story goes way back, way before that. I mean, we're talking public defender, federal prosecutor.
Yeah, and the guy claims he was right in the middle of like all the major political bombshells of like recent history.
Exactly. So Government Gangsters, this book, it's basically his chance to tell his side of the story. He really goes all in on this idea that there's a like deep state working against against the American people. He's not just like throwing out accusations. Like he's connecting the dots between things like the Russiagate investigation, the Benghazi prosecution.
Even like the raid on Mar-a-Lago.
It's a lot to unpack. So what we're going to do in this deep dive is we're going to try to understand Patel's story. Like, what did he actually experience? What evidence does he use to back up his claims? And, does his narrative actually hold up, when you really look at it?
Yeah, and to like really get where Patel's coming from, we kind of have to go back to the beginning.
Yeah.
He talks a lot about his childhood growing up as a first-generation Indian American.
Oh, he even tells this funny story about sneaking out for butter chicken with his dad.
Yeah, because his mom was a vegetarian.
I love those little details. It's like a reminder that these people who are at the center of these crazy political battles, they're still just people with like their own families and backgrounds and stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when you think about how like someone's upbringing might shape their career path. Like with Patel, he thought he was going to be a doctor at first.
Really?
Yeah, but then he decides to go to law school, thinking he's going to end up with one of those like, high-paying corporate lawyer jobs.
But he becomes a public defender in Miami.
Yeah, pretty big detour.
That's quite a turn.
It is. And
Yeah.
that's actually like kind of a key turning point in his whole story. Patel says that being a public defender, it like totally shaped how he thinks about justice. And what he sees as the government overstepping its bounds, he's representing these clients accused of, everything, drug trafficking, murder, the whole 9 yards. And he's seeing what he believes is like prosecutorial misconduct, like firsthand.
He even claims he caught a prosecutor in a Brady violation, which is basically withholding evidence that could have helped his client.
Yeah, it was a big deal, supposedly. And Patel says that like this whole experience made him distrust anyone in a position of power. And it like fueled this belief he had that the system is often rigged against, the little guy. He actually says this is why he ended up becoming a federal prosecutor, later on.
So he went from defending the accused to prosecuting them.
Yeah. But he says he wanted to like make a difference from within the system. He saw himself as this crusader for justice, taking on terrorists, criminals, anyone who was a real threat to national security.
Yeah, he mentions working on like terrorism cases in Tajikistan, even chasing down ISIS leads.
Yeah, some pretty intense stuff. And even there, he's running into roadblocks. Like he talks about how a judge threw him out of court during a terrorism case.
What? Why?
Well, because he wasn't wearing a suit. He'd just flown back from Tajikistan, and he was prioritizing the case over, formalities.
Wow. Sounds like even when he's working within the system, he's like clashing with authority, always focused on the mission no matter what.
Yeah. And this tension, it really comes to a head when he's at the Department of Justice, specifically with the Benghazi prosecution.
Right. And this is where he really starts to go after what he calls the politicized DOJ. Right.
Exactly. Patel says he was deep in the weeds, building this case against the terrorists who attacked the U.S. compound in Benghazi. And he was just so frustrated with like how the Obama administration he felt they were reluctant to go after more of them. Like they were holding back for political reasons.
So even before he joins the Trump administration, he's already got this idea that there's a like two-tier system of justice.
Yeah, and this like colors everything that comes after, especially when he gets swept up in the whole Russiagate investigation.
Okay, so this is where things get really, really interesting. What exactly was Patel's role in all of this?
So after his time at the DOJ, Patel ends up working for the House Intelligence Committee under Devin Nunes.
Right.
And this is right when they're starting to dig into Russian interference in the 2016 election. And Patel says he went into it with an open mind, ready to like follow the evidence wherever it led.
He definitely came to some pretty strong conclusions about what went down.
He did. Patel claims that the deeper he dug, the more he saw this huge conspiracy to undermine the Trump campaign. And then later, the Trump presidency. He keeps pointing to the Carter Page FISA warrant, the Steele dossier, and what he saw as like this pattern of misconduct by the FBI and the DOJ,
He even gave his counter-investigation this name, Objective Medusa.
right? Like he's making this out to be a battle against this, like, super powerful and shadowy enemy.
The deep state.
Yeah, the deep state, operating outside the law to protect themselves.
He even says he was threatened, like, by Rod Rosenstein, and that the FBI tried to delay the release of the Nunes memo.
Totally. He's painting this picture of himself as this lone warrior, going up against these incredibly powerful people determined to bury the truth.
Sounds like something out of a movie.
I know, right? So, but what did he actually find? Like, what were the big revelations that came out of his investigation?
Yeah, what did he uncover?
Well, first, he claims that the Steele dossier, which was used to get that FISA warrant against Carter Page, it wasn't just, like, unverified. It was actually funded by the Clinton campaign
Oh, wow.
and put together by someone who clearly had it out for Trump.
So that would mean that the whole FBI investigation was, like, based on faulty information from the get-go?
That's what Patel's arguing. And he says that's just the beginning. He claims the FBI left out key information from their FISA application on purpose, and that there was this whole bigger scheme to take down Trump, involving people like James Comey, Andrew McCabe, Peter Strzok.
He's basically saying the FBI and the DOJ were on a politically motivated witch hunt against Trump.
Exactly. They were using the power of the government to attack a political opponent. And then they tried to cover it all up.
And that's what the Nunes memo was all about. Did releasing it actually change anything?
Well, Patel says it just unleashed this, like, huge backlash from what he calls the deep state and their buddies in the media. He claims they went after him and Nunes hard, trying to discredit their findings and protect the people involved.
He specifically calls out Adam Schiff, who was leading the Democrats' investigation, saying Schiff was intentionally misleading the public.
Yep. He sees Schiff and others as part of this whole effort to obstruct justice and silence anyone trying to tell the truth about what happened.
So by this point, Patel has gone from being a public defender to a federal prosecutor to, like, a key player in one of the most controversial political investigations in history.
That's one way to put it. And this whole experience, it really, like, solidified his worldview. This deep distrust of parts of the government and this feeling that he's, like, fighting this righteous battle against a corrupt and powerful enemy.
It's quite the story, and from what I understand, it's just the beginning. Next time, we'll dig into Patel's time in the White House, his role on the National Security Council, and all the drama that comes with being in the Trump administration.
Yeah, we're just getting started. Buckle up.
Last time, we were talking about how Kash Patel basically became, like, convinced that there were all these people working against Trump, inside and outside the government.
Totally. And that idea, it really comes through when he joins the Trump administration.
Right.
He starts out at the National Security Council, managing international organizations.
Okay.
But then, pretty quickly, he gets promoted. Senior Director for Counterterrorism.
Wow. So he goes from investigating this so-called deep state to working in the very place he thinks is, like, compromised. That seems kind of risky.
Yeah, you'd think. And Patel, he says there was a ton of conflict. Like, he was constantly butting heads with these bureaucrats who he thought were, resisting Trump's agenda at every turn. He even suggests that some of them were actually trying to undermine the president.
He calls these people the bad, right?
Yeah, the bad. It's a pretty strong term. Like, he's saying they're the villains in his story.
Yeah.
It's not just, like, one specific group. He uses it to describe, all sorts of people. Career civil servants, political appointees, anyone he thought was more loyal to, like, the system than to Trump.
So how does he even function in that environment? I mean, the guy's not exactly known for holding back, but he's also surrounded by people who he thinks are actively working against him.
Well, if you believe his book, he just, like, keeps his head down and focuses on the mission. He talks about how he was determined to make Trump's agenda happen no matter what, even if it meant making enemies.
Okay, but did it work?
Patel claims he was able to accomplish quite a bit, especially when it came to counterterrorism.
Okay, see, this is where things get interesting to me. We haven't really talked about this side of Patel yet. He's not just this political brawler going after the deep state. He's also, like, involved in these high-stakes national security situations, making decisions that could, have real consequences.
That's a good point. And Patel, he spends a lot of time in the book talking about this part of his job. Like, he claims he helped secure the release of over 50 American hostages who were being held overseas.
Wow, seriously?
Yeah. He even says he went to Syria himself to negotiate with the Assad regime.
Oh, wow. That's intense.
It is. Talking to a guy like Assad, I mean, that's a huge risk.
It is.
What was his motivation for doing that?
Yeah.
Well, he frames it as a matter of, like, duty and compassion. He says he felt this deep sense of responsibility to get these Americans home, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen.
That's a powerful story. It makes you think about this whole thing in a different light. Here's a guy who's accusing parts of the government of being corrupt and self-serving, but then he's putting his own neck on the line to save Americans being held by, like, a brutal dictator.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
And it shows how Patel's story isn't so black and white.
Mm.
You know, he can be this fierce partisan one minute and then deeply compassionate the next.
Right. And then there's the raid that killed Baghdadi, the ISIS leader.
Yeah.
He talks about being in the Situation Room with Trump and the other top officials, watching the whole thing go down in real time.
It's a pretty gripping account.
Yeah.
All that tension and uncertainty. And then, you know, the relief when they finally got confirmation that Baghdadi was dead.
He also mentions this really moving detail about how the Special Forces team, they actually named the operation after Kayla Mueller. She was an American aid worker who was kidnapped and killed by ISIS.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a reminder of how real this stuff is, you know, that fight against terrorism, the human cost.
Yeah, absolutely. But even while all this is going on, all these successes, Patel's still dealing with pushback from who he calls the bad, you know, inside the government. He claims they're dragging their feet on orders, leaking stuff to the press, basically doing everything they can to sabotage Trump's agenda.
He even describes trying to get documents declassified related to the Russiagate investigation.
Yeah.
And he says intelligence officials tried to block him, claiming that releasing the information would put national security at risk.
Right. This whole tension between transparency and secrecy, it comes up again and again in Patel's book.
Yeah.
He's convinced the government is hiding stuff from the American people, and he's determined to get it out in the open.
Okay, so this leads us to one of the most controversial parts of the book, Patel's account of Trump's first impeachment.
Right. He claims the whole thing was cooked up based on, like, false accusations by Alexander Vindman and Eric Ciaramella, you know, the so-called whistleblower who raised concerns about Trump's phone call with the Ukrainian president.
Right.
And Patel says these guys, who he believes were just trying to get Trump out of office, they twisted the truth to make it look like he did something wrong.
He even suggests that Fiona Hill, who worked on the National Security Council and testified during the impeachment inquiry, she had ties to Christopher Steele and Igor Danchenko.
Wait, the guy who's the main source for the Steele dossier?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
He's basically trying to link the impeachment to the whole Russiagate thing, saying they were both part of this bigger plot to take Trump down.
So, in Patel's mind, the impeachment was just another attempt by the deep state to, like, get rid of a president they couldn't control.
That's what he's saying. And, you know, it's an argument that a lot of Trump supporters have made. But his critics, they totally reject it. They say there was plenty of evidence to justify the impeachment inquiry.
Yeah, it's a very divisive issue.
For sure. But it shows you how Patel sees himself in all of this. He's not just working for Trump. He's, like, fighting in this huge political battle against forces he thinks are corrupt and dangerous.
Yeah.
And this leads us to another big part of his story, trying to reform the intelligence community and the Department of Defense. He says these institutions have gotten too big, too bureaucratic, and they don't answer to the American people anymore.
So it's not just complaining. He actually wants to do something about it.
Right.
What are some of his ideas?
Yeah, what does he propose?
Well, he's got a lot of them. Like, he talks about making the intelligence community smaller, cutting back the power of the ODNI, and giving Congress more control over what they do. He also wants to change the way things are classified.
Yeah.
Make it easier to declassify information that isn't really sensitive anymore. He seems to think that the government classifies too much stuff just to avoid being held accountable.
Transparency is a big deal for him, it sounds like.
Yeah, huge. He doesn't trust government secrecy. He says it usually protects the people in power, not national security.
All right, so what about the Department of Defense? I know he has some strong opinions about, like, the military-industrial complex.
Oh, he does. He's really critical of it. He basically says it's the reason we have so many endless wars.
So he's not just pointing fingers, he's actually advocating for, like, a smaller military.
Yeah, he wants to cut military spending and have a more restrained foreign policy, one that focuses on what's best for America, not for defense contractors.
I mean, that's pretty radical, especially coming from someone who worked in the Trump administration.
It is. And he has some pretty bold ideas about how to make it happen, like banning people who used to work in the defense industry from taking jobs at the Pentagon. and preventing people who worked at the Pentagon from going to work for defense contractors.
So, like, no more revolving door.
Exactly. He thinks that whole system is corrupt and just leads to conflicts of interest, and ultimately, it pushes America into wars it doesn't need to fight.
Interesting. What else?
Well, he wants to make the military's procurement process, how they buy stuff,
Right.
way more efficient.
Okay.
He says right now it's just a way for defense contractors to get rich, and it doesn't actually help the troops get what they need.
Mm.
And he's also worried about the military becoming too political. He thinks that's a really dangerous trend. He wants to get rid of officers who are motivated by politics and go back to a system where experience and competence are what matters most.
Wow, he's basically calling for, like, a total overhaul of how we do national security in this country.
Yeah, pretty much. Whether you agree with him or not, you got to admit, it's a bold vision.
It is.
And it really makes you think about who has the power in our democracy and what the government's role should be in our lives.
Absolutely. So, next time, we're going to dive into Patel's specific proposals for reform in more detail. Okay, so Patel lays out all these problems, right? Like, he's saying the system is rigged against people like Trump, but he doesn't just leave it at that, does he? He actually has some ideas about how to fix things, how to dismantle this quote-unquote deep state.
Yeah, he does. He actually gets pretty specific about what he thinks needs to change. And it's not just vague ideas, it's like concrete proposals.
Okay, so let's dig into those. Where does he even start?
Well, a lot of it focuses on the Department of Justice. He thinks they need a major overhaul, like top to bottom, to make sure they're being fair and impartial.
He keeps bringing up this idea of selective prosecutions, right? Like the idea that people are being targeted because of their politics, not because they actually did something wrong.
Exactly. And he uses examples like Steve Bannon getting indicted for contempt of Congress, but other people who, according to Patel, also lied to Congress. They didn't get charged with anything.
So he's saying there's a double standard.
Yeah, that's his argument. And he had some pretty big ideas about how to fix it. Like, he wants to change the actual justice manual to have, clearer rules about who gets prosecuted and for what.
So less wiggle room for individual prosecutors.
That's the idea.
I mean, it sounds good in theory, but is that even possible? Wouldn't that make it harder for the DOJ to, actually do their job in some cases?
Yeah, it's definitely a controversial idea.
Yeah.
People who agree with Patel would say it's absolutely necessary to, prevent politics from influencing these decisions. But the people who disagree, they probably say just create this rigid system that can't deal with, the nuances of real-life cases.
Right, right. Okay, so what about the FBI? He's got a lot to say about them, too, right?
Oh, yeah. And this is where things get really wild. His biggest proposal for the FBI is to literally move their headquarters out of D.C.
Seriously? Move the whole thing?
Yep.
Wow. What's the thinking there?
So Patel believes that being in D.C. makes the FBI way too susceptible to political pressure and what he calls institutional capture, where the agency basically becomes more about protecting itself and its own power than serving the people.
Interesting.
He thinks it breeds this culture of careerism and ambition where agents are more worried about getting ahead than they are about, actually doing good.
So move them out of GC and the problem solved, just like that.
Well, that's what he's saying. He thinks it would force the FBI to focus more on, actual law enforcement and less on plain politics.
Okay, I can see the logic there, but wouldn't that also be a logistical nightmare, like moving an entire agency like that?
Yeah, it'd be a huge undertaking. And people who disagree with Patel, they'd probably say it's more about symbolism than actually changing anything. They might argue that real reform has to come from within the FBI, like changing the leadership, how they train agents, how they're overseen, not just moving their offices.
Right, makes sense. But wait, hold on. He doesn't just want to move them, does he? He also has ideas about how to change the way the FBI works internally.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah.
He wants to cut down the size of the general counsel's office. He thinks they have too much power and that they're too involved in, deciding who gets prosecuted and stuff. And he wants a more decentralized FBI where there's less power at the top and more emphasis on experience in the field,
Yeah.
Back to basics approach to law enforcement.
Okay, interesting. And what about the intelligence community more broadly? I mean, he's not a fan, right?
Definitely not. He wants to see it get smaller and more streamlined, with Congress having more say in what they do.
So more oversight.
Yeah, he's particularly focused on the ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence.
Yeah.
He wants to cut their power way back. He thinks they're too bureaucratic and that they keep expanding their mission into areas they shouldn't be involved in.
Okay, and what about his idea of making it easier to declassify information?
Oh yeah, that's a big one for him. He thinks the government classifies way too much stuff just to avoid scrutiny.
So, more transparency.
Exactly. Transparency is like his mantra. He just doesn't trust the government to keep secrets.
Okay, so we've talked about the DOJ, the FBI, the intelligence community. What about the Department of Defense? What does he want to change there?
Well, this is where things get maybe the most controversial. He's really, really critical of the military-industrial complex. He says it's basically a machine designed to keep America in a constant state of war.
Right, and we talked about that a bit last time. He even wants to cut military spending.
Yeah, that's one of his big proposals.
Hmm.
And he wants to see a much more restrained foreign policy, one that puts American interests first, not the interests of, defense companies.
Okay, so how does he think we can get there?
Well, he has some pretty radical ideas. Like I mentioned before, he wants to ban anyone who used to work in the defense industry from working at the Pentagon, and vice versa. No more going back and forth between those two worlds.
So break up the revolving door.
Yeah, exactly. He thinks that's a huge part of the problem. It creates all these conflicts of interest, and it pushes us into wars we don't need to fight.
What else?
He also wants to completely overhaul how the military buys stuff. He thinks the current system is insanely wasteful and inefficient,
Yeah.
and it's all about making defense companies rich, not about giving our troops the best equipment.
Okay. Anything else?
Yeah, the last big thing is he's really concerned about the military becoming too political.
Okay.
He thinks that's a really bad sign. He wants to get rid of any officers who are making decisions based on politics, not on, what's best for the military. He wants to go back to a system where experience and competence are the only things that matter.
Wow. So he's basically saying the whole national security apparatus is messed up.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, you can agree or disagree with the solutions, but you got to admit, it's a bold vision. He's not afraid to challenge the status quo.
Not at all. And it really raises some big questions, doesn't it? Like, how much power should the government have? And are they really serving the people or are they serving themselves?
Absolutely. I
Mm.
mean, Patel's story, it's just one perspective,
Hmm.
but it makes you think. It makes you question things.
It does. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap things up. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into government gangsters. We've heard Patel's claims about the deep state. We've looked at his evidence and we've explored his ideas for reform. It's been quite a ride.
It has. But remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation. There's so much more to explore here.
Right. So we encourage everyone to keep digging, keep asking questions, keep learning.
And most importantly, keep thinking for yourselves.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us.